right, guys, welcome back. So the last two objectives, we have been looking at progressive presidents and kind of talking about some of the things that they did during their presidencies. For the rest of the unit, we're going to take the progressive era and we're going to look at it thematically. Like we're going to look at economic reform today. Tomorrow, we're going to look at political reform. Then we'll look at women's rights. Then we'll look at the fight for racial equality. And then we'll end the unit with looking at some successes and failures. So in the next few days, you're going to see some things that we've definitely already talked about this unit. Just we may expand upon them a little bit more and then connect them to other similar topics that are in those objectives. So for example, today we're looking at economic reform. We'll definitely be talking about trust busting, but we'll also be looking at some other ways that the economy or how people made money and the jobs they did were changed during the progressive era. All right, so we'll start off actually with trust busting, right? Increased business regulation, which is something that progressives really wanted to do. We talked about some trust busting efforts already in the last two objectives, the Sherman Antitrust Act and the Clayton Antitrust Act. Both of these things made trusts and monopolies illegal. There was also some muckraking work done during the time period to expose how some of these trusts were trying to get around some of these laws that were designed to ban them. For example, Ada Tarbell, she is a muckraker focusing specifically on Rockefeller's trusts and monopolies. She wrote A History of Standard Oil, which was a book that essentially exposed what Rockefeller was doing and helped to basically raise public awareness and support for ending trusts in the economy. There were also some efforts made by the federal government to regulate the railroad industry, specifically shipping costs and making sure that like farmers could afford shipping costs. So some of these laws are the Interstate Commerce Act, the Mann-Elkins Act, the Hepburn Act. You just need to know in general, these were a set of laws that were designed to regulate the railroad shipping industry and bring shipping costs down. We also see that there is a period of like new labor activism that's going on. We talked about unions last unit, but we know that they largely were not successful because they would devolve into violence and then the public didn't support them. But during the progressive era, we see a new resurgence of labor unions and labor activism. One of the most popular unions at this point was called the Industrial Workers of the World, or the IWW. The point of the IWW is to basically create one worldwide international labor union. It was open to all workers of all industries, skill levels, races, sexes. And the idea was that you would create this enormous labor union and it would be so big that the workers would have to have their rights and demands recognized. It was founded by Eugene Debs. We talked a little bit about him in the election of 1912. He was a socialist, and the IWW was founded on socialist ideas. Again, wanting the government to regulate big business and regulate the workplace and making it a safer place for workers, both like physically but also financially. Eugene Debs was often arrested for his beliefs in socialism, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in the 204 notes. Another labor union at the time that gained popularity was the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. That's a mouthful. But basically, this was a union mostly for women who worked in the garment or textile industry. They wanted to advocate for better working conditions in these textile mills. And they became really popular after the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, which was in 1911. It was a tragedy. 146 garment workers died. I know the headline says 154, so it looks like maybe the number was, a little unknown. However, that's a lot of people dying. A fire broke out in a textile factory, and it was really deadly because the owners had locked the doors and the exits to try to prevent theft. And the elevators in the building did not work properly. And then the stairways on the outside of the building, like the fire escapes, they were not tested to be safe. So when people started to go on the stairways, they collapsed. When the elevators weren't working, they ended up actually dying in the elevators. And many women were just trapped on the floor, in the building as it was on fire. Um, what made this story especially sensational was that some women jumped to their death. And so, you'd be walking by on the sidewalk and there were women laying dead on the ground. So it was very graphic, and it definitely got the country's attention when it came to trying to fix some of the working conditions in these textile factories. Another thing that was popular during this time was using arbitration to solve labor disagreements instead of using strikes and violence. So, arbitration is just a fancy word for when you have two groups that disagree with each other, they agree that they will let a third party who's supposed to be impartial listen to both sides and then make a decision about the outcome, and then that decision is legally binding. So, an example of using arbitration to solve a labor disagreement was with the anthracite coal strike. So, this was in 1904. You had a huge coal strike around the nation that was starting to cause issues with the economy because railroads needed coal to operate. And if you couldn't have the railroads working and shipping goods and people around the country, it definitely stalled up the economy a bit. And so Roosevelt really wanted this strike to end. And so what he did is he brought the representatives for the workers and then he brought the representatives for management to DC, and he forced them to solve their dispute uh, through arbitration. And in this case, the arbiter or the group that was making the decision was a federal commission of congressmen. And so they listened to both sides. The congressman told them, here's how we're going to end the strike, and it was ended. And so this was a good alternative to violence like we had seen in the Gilded Age when it came to strikes. We also see some workplace reforms that were initiated, especially when it comes to increasing workers' rights. There were a few Supreme Court cases, Muller v. Oregon and Bunting v. Oregon. Both of these made it constitutional to have a 10-hour workday for men and women, so it limited, working to 10 hours. Lewis Hine, we saw this in our warm-up, he exposed child labor conditions through his photographs that he took, and eventually those laws were created to outlaw child labor. Jane Addams is another woman that we've talked about previously. She was working in Chicago specifically. She founded the Hull House Settlement House, or the community centers that were popping up during the urbanization period. She was important during this time period because she helped to bring poor children off the streets and helped to find them education, helped to get them housing, like a place to live, basically helped to provide them opportunities to where they didn't have to turn to child labor as a way to survive. She got them on a path towards education and making a better life for themselves. And you can see her sitting surrounded by children. And later she won a Nobel Peace Prize for her work to help people living in poverty. And then another big thing when it comes to the economy, specifically people who are buying goods during this time, is there was a movement to protect the consumer. And this is something that we definitely talked about with Roosevelt specifically. But I want to dive a little bit deeper into why Roosevelt thought it was so important to protect the consumer. There was a book published during this time period called The Jungle, and some of you have probably heard of this. It was written by a man named Upton Sinclair. Basically, what he did is he went into Chicago's meat packing plants. These are going to be factories that turn cows into steak and ground beef and other beef products. And he went in there because he really wanted to expose the bad working conditions for the people working inside these plants. They were losing fingers, or they were losing their eyesight, or they were becoming, sick from the chemicals that were being used during the beef process. But what he actually ended up doing was also exposing these disgusting meat products that were coming out of these factories as well. Something, that was labeled as ground beef was really, mostly like ground up rat and maybe a few people's fingers. So, he has this quote where he says, I aimed at the public's heart. He was trying to get people to feel bad for the workers, but by accident, he hit them in the stomach. He made people actually really grossed out by what was happening. Either way, though, this inspires a few reforms. We have the Meat Inspection Act, which tries to reform these meatpacking plants, as well as the Pure Food and Drug Act, which said that you had to have actually, truthful and accurate labels on products that were being sold to consumers so they knew what they were putting in their bodies. Later, these two laws are going to inspire the establishment of the Food and Drug Administration, that's called the FDA, which today is in charge of everything from regulating the standard of food that we consume to medicine that we take. To kind of bring it to current events, the FDA had to approve the COVID vaccines that are now being distributed. So the FDA has a huge role in society in protecting the consumer and protecting the common people, from being taken advantage of by commercial industries that are just trying to sell us stuff. All right, so hopefully you should be able to talk about some of these economic reforms like trust busting, these new unions that are coming about, arbitration to solve labor disagreements, some workplace reforms and increased workers' rights, and then finally a little bit more about consumer protection.